Part-Time Hitter is brought to you by Friendly Forces, a 501c3 nonprofit committed to helping reserve component members seamlessly integrate their military service with rewarding civilian careers. We connect them with employers who value their unique skills and critical role in national security and advise organizations how to become more reservist-friendly. Check them out at www.friendlyforces.org. Friendly Forces is also brought to you by the Fratty Guard, a lifestyle brand for part-time hitters. Check them out at www.thefrattyguard.com and on Instagram at @thefrattyguard. Welcome to Part-Time Hitter, brought to you by Friendly Forces and the Fratty Guard. I am your host, Eric Evans, and today I'm here with Benjamin Sledge. Benjamin Sledge is a wounded combat veteran who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, mostly under the Special Operations Community USACAPOC of the U.S. Army. He is the recipient of the Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and 2 Army Commendation Medals for his actions overseas. Upon returning home, he began work in geopolitical intelligence, then moved into mental health. He holds multiple certifications in crisis response, trauma care, and suicide prevention, and continues to work in the veteran community and within geopolitics. With over 14 years of experience as a creative director, he has designed logos, websites, graphics, and ads that have been prominently featured in highly regarded publications such as Time Magazine and the New York Times. A prolific communicator, Sledge has also written several articles on masculinity, the military, relationships, and faith that have gone viral on social media, and his essays are featured regularly on Medium. From CNN and the New York Times to Fox News and Daily Wire, his writing and graphic design have graced the pages of diverse publications. His book, Where Cowards Go to Die, chronicles his time in war and personal struggles to readjust, and was released in July 2022 to critical acclaim. To date, his book has won the following awards and accolades: Gold Medal winner, Nonfiction Book Awards for Biography and Memoir; Gold Medal winner, Reader's Favorite Book Awards; winner, 2024 Book Excellence Awards. There's a bunch of them. I'm not going to read all those, Ben.
Yeah, please don't.
Ben has consulted and spoken on behalf of major entities ranging from the U.S. Military Joint Special Operations Command, Colorado State University, Volunteers of America, and even shared the stage with influential figures such as Tim Tebow. Ben currently lives in Colorado with his wife, daughter, and son. Ben, that's quite a bio. As you can see, I had to shorten it because it was just too much.
Yeah. Everyone calls me Sledge. I was like, just because of my last name. So it's funny when people are like, "Hey, Ben," and I'm like, "Who are they talking to?" So no, that name died when I stopped being a.
Too bad. So for the listeners, in Ben's book, his nickname or his call sign is Hollywood, which is it's a pretty good one as far as military nicknames go, because they're not probably usually not that cool. Anyway, thank you for joining us today. It's nice to finally have an actual pipe hitter on the show. Last few guests, total scrubs. Again, thanks for being here. Now, naturally, I wanted to have you on the show because you were an Army Reserve guy, an Army Civil Affairs guy, and you served in those capacities during the height of the GWOT, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, which I deployed much later on. And at reading your book, just our war experiences were like just universes away from each other, like not even the same war, right? It's really interesting for me to see Army Reserve guy, Civil Affairs during that time, that peak sort of violent, like everything's going on in the Middle East, everything's coming down period of time. Really interesting for me to have you on here. As I was doing some background research on you, it seems like you've done a lot of podcasts already. Yeah. We're actually just talking about that. I apologize in advance. This will probably be the one that you do. But for me, one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast is that there's a million podcasts out there about former Navy SEALs, and I was a Delta dude. I was doing this, and it's like the same stories we've heard for 20 years. You were like super secret squirrel, cool guy, cool. I'm more interested in like real people who aren't those like aspirational 1% of the 1% type dudes who do stuff with most of them.
That's the joke in the industry, in the book publishing industry, is that if you're a Navy SEAL, you get a book deal. And it's tongue in cheek for us. Like a lot of those guys are amazing dudes with amazing stories. But you're right. I'm literally submitting a piece to the Atlantic this week about how we've basically whitewashed the longest running wars in the U.S. history with just this kind of marginal fraction of one percenters that are elite military operators. And yet you had an entire generation of reservists, National Guardsmen, active duty, just regular soldiers who fought in these wars, and their experiences are largely left untold. So that's a great point you bring up.
Yeah, which was, and again, like that's 99% of the force over there, if not 99.99%, were not these elite special operators that were like 19-year-old kids told to go drive up and down a road until you hit an IED or get attacked.
That was literally the Marines we worked with. That was their go.
Yeah, I think you kind of that in your book, but like these special ops units, they have the privilege of getting to hand select their missions, having the best equipment, the best people, and the best resources. And then they go in and they do their thing. It's a very different experience from just being told, like, go just do this until you get attacked, or just go suck for a few hours, and then maybe you'll get hit, maybe you won't, and then you'll do it again the next day. You know what I mean? And you talk about this in your book, but my first question to you would be, how did you end up in...
So my grandfather was a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne in World War II. Still got like all of his stuff. I even have his like pamphlet from airborne training where he wrote notes and everything. It's the original 1944 like airborne paratrooper manual. It's pretty wild. So he had a huge influence, and my family had come from a very long lineage of military history. My great uncle Applin, he was in the Pacific during World War II, and then we traced it back as far as a general under Napoleon. And then recently, I had a guy contact me out of the blue and was like, "Hey man, I'm your distant cousin." I'm like, "That's weird. Nothing creepy about this." But he turned out to be really cool. He had been doing forensic genealogy, and he found out he was actually a Sledge, that his dad had been adopted and everything. So I was like, "Hey man, do you happen to know if I'm related to Eugene Bondurant Sledge, E.B. Sledge, who's from the Pacific?" And he was like, "Yeah, we are." I was like, "This is awesome." So he wrote with the old breed, and it became the basis for the HBO miniseries, The Pacific. But that kind of warrior ethos is just always running my family blood. And within that, I knew that I wanted to join, and I had been seriously considering it. But what pushed me over the edge is my parents they had both been to college, and like in the 90s, it's you have to go to college, like in order to get a good job. Like that was the methodology. You don't have to do that anymore today. Learn a trade. Don't go into debt like we all did. But I was like, okay. And so they pushed my brother and I really hard to go to college. So we're like, all right, we're going to go to college. We're going to study hard. And so when it came time, I was like, how am I paying for college? And they're like, you better figure that out. So I was like, I guess I'm going to join the military. And so I wanted to do college and I wanted to do the Army at the same time. And the reserve just really seemed like the best natural fit for me to take that route. And at the time, it was 1999. Clinton was president. And it's weird for me to say that now. Yes, that was literally it. It was like the last crazy thing that had happened was Mogadishu. And so it was totally different.
Right.
Like we would go bivouac, which is a really old Army term where it's camping. It's when you go to the field. And we would barbecue and have fun on drill weekends and dumb stuff. It really wasn't too much about anything serious. So yeah, that's how I ended up. It was just means to pay for college. And I also thought girls would think I looked awesome in a uniform. Stupid reason to join.
I think we all mostly think that. And then you find out.
Don't care.
Don't give a shit for the most part. Yeah, or they think you're a weirdo because you're in the military.
Yeah.
So it has the opposite effect. Did you consider other branches or always just the Army? Were they?
No, actually, I considered the Marine Corps at first. This is the funny part. Yeah, because they had the coolest ad. Let's be honest, they always did. Granted, back when I was going in, the Army still had their Be All You Can Be campaigns, and those were pretty old school, pretty clutch. I know.
We're back.
I know. I'm happy with it. And we went back to the pinks and greens, which I was like, I had to wear the dopey. I still have the dopey green ones.
I have ideas, man.
The dopey green Vietnam era dress. The Class A's.
Driver looking ones.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, dude. We're just out of ideas. We took like what kind of work, and we're like, oh, we'll do that. And we'll try it again. And yeah.
Come on. The Marine Corps had a dude like fighting a fire demon.
He had a saber. Their uniforms always, dude. I've said this forever. Like and they did it with the pinks and greens, but just give guys like you and me who mostly want to impress women a sexy uniform, and we'll siphon off tons of the Marine Corps recruits to the Army. Just give them a better uniform, better marketing, better commercial. Show them getting women in the commercial, and we'll get those recruits. But I don't know, man. Army marketing, like,
there's that old 70s Marine Corps Reserve one where he's like on a beach with a chick, and he was like, they're like, you want to be a man? You're like, all right, I guess I'll join the Marine.
That's an amazing commercial. You probably couldn't use that commercial today, though, for reasons, right?
It bordered on a Bud Light commercial.
My other question would be, dude, I love that commercial. I truly do.
So yeah,
and you don't hear much about it.
I was just gonna say, yeah, I consider the Marines. So, but my parents put their foot down and they're like, no freaking way, you're not joining the Marines. And then I ended up, it didn't matter. I went to war anyway. So all their fears became actualized, and probably worse.
Yeah, I don't know if you touched on this in your book, but did you even know what civil affairs was, what we were signing up to do, or did you just kind of like?
So there was this guy that my parents knew, and there was this nearby unit that wasn't far from my house, and I met with this guy. His name was Mike, and he was like their S1 or whatever, basically their admin guy, and he was talking about all the cool stuff they do. And we're special operations. We have guys that have come out of the Green Berets, and you'll get to do cool missions in South America because that's where our area of focus. And I was like, that sounds pretty cool. I don't know about the time constraints though. And my parents were pushing me to do like dumb, safe stuff, which is so funny because it's the 90s. They're like, be a quartermaster, be a mail clerk. And I was like, no. But when I got to MEPS, I had scored really high on my ASVAB. So I had a lot of options, and they wanted me to go military intelligence. And I took one look at like how long I would be in training for. And they had like this year and it was like a year and a half. And I was like, what? And they were like, yeah, you're going to go to language school too. This is with a language school kicker. And I was like, no, I'm not doing that. And so I called that dude from the unit literally while I was at MEPS, and I was like, hey, they're not going to give me this CA slot. And he was like, hold on. And he like shot something through and it went straight through. And then I got the CA slot. So signed on that. My parents didn't know. I was like, I'll figure it out when I get to MEPS. I'll pick a job. And so I come home and they're like, what'd you do? I was like, oh, I joined that unit not too far here in the Tulsa area. And they're like, which one is it? I was like, some special operations one. And they were like, what? Yeah.
How far away were you from the unit? Was it like in your backyard?
Or it was in the Sand Springs area. So it was about a 30-minute drive. It wasn't far.
I've never been to Oklahoma, but I hear you don't hear much about Oklahoma either. Should I go to Oklahoma?
So it's an interesting place. The people are super friendly. That's the best thing about Oklahoma. But I don't know. It's weird. It's weird being an Okie. You're okay. This is my hometown. This is where I'm from. But there's some stuff that's we're like horrible as far as education. I think it's like number 48 out of all the states. Obesity, disease, stuff like that. It doesn't fare well. And then, it's the buckle of the Bible Belt too. So there's like a lot of religiosity mixed in with politics, and it gets super bizarre in that respect.
Yeah.
So I like it. It's where I'm from. It's where I went to college. And there's a lot of things that are up and coming. Tulsa is blowing up right now. It's like the downtown area has been revitalized. They got a lot of cool new restaurants and bars that have gone in. So it's coming around for sure. And it's a great place. And the cost of living is like dirt cheap. If you still want to be able to go and buy a house for $150,000, go to Oklahoma. Yeah, it can totally happen.
Is that a place where you might buy like a?
Oh yeah,
like a
that's like what all the country stars do. They all got ranches in Oklahoma. Like friggin' what's his face? Blake Shelton lives in Tishomingo, and we all have these weird Indian names there too for our towns. So you can always tell when somebody's not from there. They're just butchering the names.
So you had sent me a copy of the book, which is how I started reading it, and I realized I didn't have the time to be like sitting down and reading it, so I ended up
Bradford did a good job.
Which, by the way, I noticed you didn't read the book yourself, which some authors do choose to do. Not a best practice, I would say. But the guy who's reading it, he's having to do the different accents of the different soldiers, and they all end up just sounding like Bill Clinton, like a different version of Bill Clinton. But he's doing these like I don't know if that's what an Oklahoma accent sounds like or not, but I kept thinking this guy sounds like Bill Clinton. James
Oh yeah.
Jameson, I think that was his name. He sounded like, according to this, the
Well,
narrator
yeah.
of your book.
His real name is Peterson. Yeah, I can tell you that much. But I didn't
Oh,
have the.
uh,
I couldn't get a hold of him. We hadn't stayed in contact, and I was trying to see if he could. He wanted his actual name in the book and whatnot, so I had to use a pseudonym for him. But he went. We called him Pete Peterson, so I just changed it to James Jameson in the book. I did a lot of stuff like that. Like one of my buddies in the book, he's an Air Force ETAC. He's in the beginning, and his last name is actually one of the vacuum cleaner brands. So I changed it to Bissell, and I was like, vacuum cleaner jokes. And he was like, God, I hate you. Yeah.
just out of curiosity, because I've never really been clear with this process. Did you have to submit this, or did you submit it through the Pentagon?
No, we would have there. So it was on the cusp. I had told a story in there about a couple of special activities guys that I had worked with over in Skin. And I know what actually happened to them, and it's not reported. And they're like, look, if you include this in the book, like they're either going to redact it or you're going to get caught up in like extreme amounts of red tape. Yeah. So everything in there has either been independently verified or verified by all the guys that I interviewed for the book. So we didn't have to submit to the Pentagon, or it's open source, non-classified information. So we left it at that. Yeah, because there was a few classified things that I had put in there initially, and they're like, "Look, man, this will never get published."
This cool, but
yeah,
cause headaches. Yeah, for sure. In that vein, I'm a bit envious because while you were in the Army and doing all your stuff, like USACAPOC,
the Great Divorce.
It was called USACAPOC at that time. Okay, it still fell under USOC, so it still was part of the Special Operations community. I think around 2010-ish. Something like that. They moved it under USARC, U.S. Army Reserve Command, and now it's this weird kind of gray area where we're not officially under Special Operations, but we still unofficially are. There's still a lot of like relationships there, and some things we do, we have to mark that we're Special Operations. So it's a bizarre thing. I feel like we lost something when we moved from USASOC to USARC. We're no longer under Special Operations Command, and what are you? I don't know. You were probably out by the time that
2010.
Happened. What year did you get out?
Yeah, I'll explain the Great Divorce especially for the listeners. So originally, I've gotten into this is so many arguments with dudes who just don't know. So I was there. I know it's public open source information. You can totally look all this stuff up. So originally Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations was created out of a need during Vietnam from the Snake Eaters, your special forces guys. They realize like they're having to deal a lot with the civilian populace, and they're also working to influence, persuade, and change the opinions and views of the people in the Vietnam area. And so that's why our patches look so similar. If you look at the use of KPOC patch, it's literally a shield and then a sword with 2 lightning bolts. And then the Special Forces one is a spade with a sword and 3 lightning bolts. So they were just like, we'll take it something similar.
Right.
So what they realized is if they could train soldiers in the arts of diplomacy, geopolitics, history, information, human, which is the gathering of intelligence, then they could minimize civilian interference on the battlefield, and along in conjunction with the psychological operations soldiers, run campaigns that persuaded and changed and influenced the populace at large. And so they're like, okay, these guys need to be highly specialized. They need to go through this training at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center. They need to attend language training as well, too, so that they understand the areas that they're in. And they need to understand the history, background, and occasion of what's happened there throughout all of history. And when that happened, they were like, these guys are under special operations. And so you had the Army Reserve side and you had the active duty side. And there was only one active duty civil affairs unit, which I believe was 95th or 96. I can't remember. There's been so many that they've added on now. And if you wanted to go active, it was simple as now you have to go to selection. So this is funny. Everyone's like, how did you do all the special operations CA stuff? And I was like, they needed bodies for the meat grinder. They were like, can you walk? Can you breathe? Can you pass this test? Get on in here. So it's really funny because I've trained a couple guys here because I live on the footsteps of Fort Carson for selection for CA, and they've gotten through just because I know what they're going to be looking for and how they're going to run them too. And CA loves to ruck everybody to death. That's our thing. Whereas SF guys have that little log timber. They're like, nope, just put on a backpack and march for like days. Out of that, anyway, the training is that you would go to Fort Bragg or Fort Liberty now, and you would go through the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and school. So you're in the schoolhouse. We are at Camp McCall. You're helping do Robin Sage with the Special Forces soldiers. We did all of that. And then soldiers who scored high enough while you were there on your ASFAB, or not ASFAB, D-Lab, is that what it is? Defense Language Aptitude Battery? It's the made up language that they do. And so they would do this made up language test. And if you scored high enough, then you got to go to Defense Language Institute in Monterey Bay, California. And so a lot of it just came down to how active you wanted to be in the community as a reservist. There were tons of opportunities. If you wanted to do more than a drill weekend, if you wanted to go active guard reserve, basically, they always had stuff that was ongoing to where you could do that. And so it was this great community of reservists and active duty components. And I don't think they really knew just how important we were going to be to the GWOT in the future of the U.S. military, especially for LSCO, the large-scale combat operations that they're focusing on now. And so out of that, it worked really well for a while. And then in 2006, they made the decision to move us out from the Special Operations Command into the United States Army Reserve Command. And it really didn't happen until, I would say, right as I was getting out in 2010 is when everything switched over. Because I was still getting all my orders from USASOC. Anytime I went anywhere, I was still under that command. I've kept all my orders too, just to show people, like, it's got the headline, it's the United States Special Operations Command, this is this. And so then everything changed. And we call that in the community, in the USACAPOC community, the Great Divorce. Because what it did was it effectively made people who are a large component of the civil affairs and psychological operations mission not as highly specialized. And during the GWOT, they would just hand our job over to infantry line unit guys. And they had such a need for us that they were pulling guys from the IRR. They were like, when we left overseas, they had just trained up some Navy guys because they were so short staffed. And they're like, look, you're CA people now. And these were like Navy dudes from like the IRR who was not their job. And we were like, they're totally going to screw up all the progress that we just made because we knew what we were doing. We had been through the training. We understood what was going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it made things, I would say, impossibly worse for the USACAPOC community. And there's a difference of opinion now between the active duty guys because they're like, oh, they don't go through selection and they don't go through as much training now. And the CA guys can go to special missions units now as well too. And they're thought very highly of now because the military has realized we need to train these people to go into these foreign environments and do their work with a local indigenous population. And the more specialized and trained they are, the better results they're going to have. And so my unit always had great results because of the fact that we had subject matter experts on everything. So we had guys that were electricians that were able to do or master electricians who understood power grids and systems like while we were in Iraq, so that we could bid on projects and everything else. We understood the language, the culture, the history, the background. And so when you just trained up dudes and just slammed them through a machine, it makes sense that they just split that off and they're like, this isn't working. And I think that's really what happened, why the divorce happened, is they had such a need for us and we were all on stop loss anyway, that they just started training up these other guys, which kind of ruined a lot of the war effort. And they're like, all right, this isn't working. We're going to just take this under the active duty special operations side. And the reality is it takes time to train up highly specialized soldiers to understand a mission and like why people in Iraq are mad at each other from like an event that happened 2,000 years ago. And other people are like, we don't care. We're here to kill bad guys. Whereas that's our job to understand that. And so out of that, I think it's caused a lot of problems that could have really been nipped in the bud had they just kept us under the special operations community and doing more of that highly specialized training and encouraging the men and women in those communities to take that seriously. And instead, I think what we have now is they really don't know what to do with the reserve element side, because I don't think the United States Army Reserve Command knows really what to do with civil affairs and psychological operations soldiers at all.
I know USACAPOC makes up the vast majority of like deployments and uses the vast majority of funding from the Army Reserve, because they're the most like basically high op tempo reserve soldiers in, you know, like in the reserve. I think that the true strength, especially in CA of USACAPOC, is we're in the military, we have training, blah, blah, blah. Generally, especially now, because we don't get access to that, some of the more specialized training, we're not going to be generally as tactically proficient now, but we're bringing in all this other expertise that you touched on, and not just people who are cops or electricians or geologists or whatever it may be, but people like me who are sort of consultant types in the business world. What you learn is how to get buy-in, how to sell something, working with different groups, like massaging in the gray area, how to bring people together and pitch an idea and get an outcome, which is not something I think that even if you've been to like a lot of high speed training, if you've only been active duty, you don't necessarily have that same life experience to be able to do that. And that's where I see, even in my unit, we get a lot of very high speed captains coming from the active duty CA component, and they're very good tactically. A lot of schools, they know what's going on, they know the regulations in a way that like I have no idea what the regulation is, but they're not as good at operating in that area of like when there's not strict guidelines or strict parameters, what do we do here? And that's where we come in. Well, let's just do it this way. This makes sense. Let's do this. So I think that's the key thing that reservists in CA like really bring to the fight. I do agree. I wish they would go back to more of a hybrid model where we have more opportunities to jump in if we want to into some of that more specialized training if you have people who are motivated to do that, and then they bring
and that was really beneficial for us, because like we were all going to Defense Language Institute, we had dudes going to Pathfinder, we always had the airborne and air assault slots, and we'll always take those up, I think, from the reserve side. But yeah, I even did language refresher courses out at Fort Bragg. I was doing combat training and then medic training. We were doing combat lifesaver, all of it, and then additional training on top of that before we left, just from highly specialized guys that allowed us to be extremely tactically proficient in environments where sometimes you're going into a home, you're talking with a local or sheikh or a warlord or whatever it is, and things go great. And then other times things go horribly wrong and suddenly you're being shot at. And that's the thing that I tell people all the time. I was like, you get to see the best and worst parts of war with the civil affairs community because of the fact that you're working to rebuild and to have the population take over their own areas and kick out an insurgency or whatever it is, or minimize that on the battlefield. So you're either going to make a lot of friends or you're going to get shot at a lot. And so you need to have the training in both. And if you don't, then it's going to set you up for failure. And so like the training that we got came in so clutch, especially just working on this article. It's a story that I didn't tell in my book. It's from the perspective of two other guys that were there. One of them, he was 19 years old when this event happened. And it was one of the largest clearing operations that we did in Ramadi, Iraq. And then his lieutenant, and we were, this is how short staffed we were during the surge, is we were taking lieutenant promotables, running them through CAQC, like the officer side, and then being like, okay, you guys are in charge. There's supposed to be a captain the same way that the SF guys, but they were doing the same thing with the SF leaders as well too, because we were so short staffed. There was no draft. And so they're like, we got to slam these guys through the system. So we had this lieutenant, he was a Mustang named Morgan Ashworth. And so you had a private first class and then a first lieutenant, and they had to go on this clearing operation, and they were with infantry line unit, and we were the guys with the interpreters. And then just like all hell broke loose while they were out. Tried to inform the captain in charge of the column that like, hey, there's IEDs in the wall where we're headed, based on the information that we gathered from the guys whose house we were just at and talking with. That dude didn't want to hear it. Of course, the IED in the wall explodes, takes out Iraqi special forces and Iraqi army guys that my dudes are with, blows the legs off this one guy. They all have to run out after fire. The thing is, the infantry guys froze up, and then the CA guys didn't, because we had that tactical training repeatedly while we were at Fort Bragg. So my two guys, they went to town. They were just grabbing and running injured soldiers out from the middle of the street into a courtyard. And we knew to keep multiple Cat 5 tourniquets on us because of our combat triage chaos training. And even though there was a team medic there, he was all froze up because of the fighting was so intense. And it was these 2 CA guys that went in, ratcheted down all these tourniquets, called in a casevac, did all the life-saving medic stuff because we had been trained in that. And then the guys finally came back around, they unfroze, and they ended up having to, because the Bradleys and everything just kept getting blown up on the way, they ended up having to run back to the base, almost doing like a Mogadishu mile, and they were just shot to hell when they got in there. But it was 2 CA guys that saved that entire column because the training in both their medic, the additional medic work that they had, the tactical side of things, and then also you got to remember we have our interpreter, they're talking with the locals, they're gathering intelligence, and they tried to warn somebody, and those 2 guys got Bronze Stars with Valors for their action that day. 19-year-old kid and lieutenant. And here's the cool thing about both of them is one of them went on to own his own company, so he owns his own business now. The other one, he went on to get his PhD in genetic reproduction and studied at Yale.
Wow. No, that's awesome. And that's the thing. Even the active duty guys, like at that time, they're being, hey, you enlist, you go to basic, you go to AIT, and you're in Iraq. So it's not like they're just throwing their bodies.
Yeah, that was literally it. And like that, I don't know if your listeners know this, but like during 2006 to 2007, that's when we were like just taking anybody. It was like, oh, you're a felon? Like we can get a waiver for that. Tattoos on your head and your hands, we don't care. Come on in here. I just remember one time it was like, yeah, my choice was like go to jail or join the army. And I was like, what? So.
Yeah, I think they ended up seeing, maybe even still today, some of the downstream effects from the quality of some of the people that they took who would then promote into leadership positions, but they're now, why are these rates of assault and just all this going up? It's because look at the quality of people you were taking during the time. But yeah, I always try to stress that inevitably CA teams generally get attached to infantry companies or infantry battalions. So it's like you're in it with your dudes. So you got to be able to hold your own and be ready to do work when something pops off. You can't just be like, hey, those guys are shooting at us. We're going to go back to the team room while you guys figure that out. Were you treated? Because I guess pre 9/11, I don't know if many, maybe in the special operations community, but I don't know if the reserve and guard had as much integration with the active duty. I almost feel like it was a new thing to have reservists in the mix dealing with active duty like units in a war. Were you treated differently? Did they understand exactly who you were and like what you were doing? Or
we never brought up
what was the dynamic?
Reservist. We just brought up that we were highly specialized. Like, hey, this is our job. This is what we train for. And everybody just assumed we were active duty because we were there doing the same stuff with them. And technically we were on active duty. And most of us had been on active duty or they had initially started out on active duty in the military. So like when I was when my time in service was done, after I got home from Iraq and did a couple more TDYs, temporary duty stations and stuff, I had already had 4 years of active duty. So I was like, whatever. And I'm a reservist and so I was like, I didn't really look at myself that way. And plus, like at that point, here's the other thing too. CA guys, because we're attached to so many people, like we would just, me and my friends, we would go to these like courses and then every day we would just swap out our combat patches because I was authorized to wear 8 of them. So one morning I would show up with 82nd, the next I'd show up with Guadalcanal, like first Mardiv. And like my instructor was like, what the hell? They just thought I was like some PX Ranger. And I was like, nah, see, so you're always being attached. You're always working with these people. So you tend to have more experience than the average soldier. And then the other thing too is I knew tons of active duty guys that just sat on the base the entire time. We called them FOBITs and everything else. And not to take away from their service or anything else, but I think there's a huge difference between a bunch of reservists that like, and Mike Ritland asked me this on a recent podcast. He goes, how often were you outside the wire and on combat operations? I was like, oh, almost daily. He said, so how many do you think you did? I said, about 300 because I was there for 15 months in Iraq. And he was like, 300? I was like, yeah, I was just outside the wire every day. And it was either it was a good day or you're getting a shot at day. And then he was like, 300, that's nuts. And I was like, that's just Iraq. I was like, if we're counting Afghanistan, it's close to 500. And he was like, good night. And so when people think of like the reservists, they're like, oh, these poor suckers that got their numbers punched or whatever. And a lot of us we were needed during that time period, during the GWOT. And we were specialized and trained in a way that I think worked really well for those that were under use of KPOC. I think when we started just chunking soldiers through courses just to say, and now I'm going to patriophilia, now you're CA or whatever, it went very poorly for us. And I think we saw the effects of that because if you look at COIN, counterinsurgency operations, when we went into Ramadi and like what we did there, we totally shifted the entire Iraq war narrative. by using that and working with Colonel Sean McFarland, who's now Lieutenant General McFarland, and 1st Armored Division, we flipped that entire city. When we got 18 hours, this was my team. This is our team of civil affairs soldiers. We were the guys who got 18 hours of consistent power across Ramadi. The shooting stopped because they had their creature comforts back. So when you look at like the war effort of that stuff, it worked really well. And then they started slamming all these dudes through, and then everything like it was on the up, and then it just crashed and burned.
So I saw that personally. When I joined CA, I had researched it pretty heavily. I was into the mission. I felt it aligned to some of my other experience. But when I got to CACCC, there were people there who seemingly, and these are like captains, who seemingly just wound up in CA, had no idea what it was, like no real interest. I'm just like, what are you doing here? Why are you here if you don't even know what civil affairs is or what we're supposed to do? And that was a point of contention for me, to the point where it was actually pointed out to me by the instructors that it seemed like I had a bad attitude or frustration with some of my other students, which I did. But I'm like, dude, you're a captain, you're an officer, do some research. Don't act like you've been there before, essentially, and get into the mission. Would you, and actually something you said about the patches too, I'm curious, what patch, did you have a favorite patch?
I 82nd. And just because of my grandfather, I was with 3504th Blue Devils before they disbanded. It was my very first deployment, Afghanistan, out Oregon, and then 10th Mountain took over. And I had a tendency to wear the 82nd one because it's my family history, and it's like, hey, don't forget where you came from.
You tell a story in the book. I'm not going to give all the details, but essentially you have a patching ceremony from a unit that you guys weren't particularly fond of, and that rang so true to me because I also did not want to wear the patch of the unit that I deployed under. So I actually ended up working a drug deal with an active duty 05. We did some stuff for him, and he wrote up a memo so we could wear a different patch. That's how strongly I didn't want to wear the patch of the brigade that I fell under. So I was like, man, I totally get that. I didn't go to the same extreme lengths.
For your listeners, we were tossing
your guys.
So they awarded us the combat patches and stuff, and gave us like a stack of them. We ended up just taking them to like all the urinals in Ramadi and just peeing on them because we were like, oh, these are great for urinal cakes. And it got pretty malicious towards the end. There's some stuff that some of the young guys did that, hey, we're going to do some stuff. And all the team sergeants were all like, we don't want to know. And if you get caught, that's on you. Yep. Yeah, because they hated the command that much. It involved hijacking one of the brigade sergeant major's gator that he got to ride around on, apparently.
Ooh, that's a high-risk operation.
I love that you use the word drug deals because we were always doing that. That's such a CA term because you're like, yeah, I'm going to work this drug deal, and everyone's.
It was like to get anything done was like these drug deals. There was this whole black market economy of giving people like. So for us, we would either do work for them, or people would come by and want us to do work. So they'd bribe us with pallets of Rippets and things like that. And it's just like all these little backdoor deals everyone was working to try to get things
funds
done.
And all types of stuff. Yeah.
Would you recommend today people join not just the military but the reserve, or are you an advocate for that, or have you, based on the way things are, you perceive them to be, maybe wouldn't recommend
so
it?
I have a couple of thoughts on it. I push everyone to join the military. I think if you look at the rate of mental health issues, and this goes into my expertise in this area, you have Gen Z that's largely aloof and lost and feels like they don't have a purpose. And if you go into Jonathan Haidt's work, like where he does Anxious Generation and the Coddling of the American Mind, a lot of that's a screen-based childhood now, and where people are just consumed and absorbed by a small black screen as opposed to interaction and human connection. And the military provides that. It provides the connection, the type of environment where people have your back, that they're going to watch over you, that they care for you. And so I think, and what I've seen is when young people join the military, they seem to adjust better to life. There's a lot of data as far as post-traumatic stress. And it's silly because the GWOT's largely over. So a lot of guys that have gotten out and not deployed, I think what they're dealing with are transition disorders because of the fact they had that community and they had a lifestyle where people cared about them. And then they go into a corporate environment where their boss does not care about them, and neither does their coworkers, and everything's about profit. And so they'll struggle in that respect because in the military, it's, oh, I'm going to work and earn towards this, and this guy's got my back. And granted, that's not the military across the board, but largely it's what we try to do and try to impart upon our soldiers. It's difficult now, especially I'm on Carson pretty often. And so you get to see and observe and watch stuff, and there's a lot of lacks. Like, I never liked conventional Army, but there are rules and standards for reasons. I went to a promotion ceremony recently for a buddy of mine who got promoted to a full bird colonel. And so I was doing the opening remarks for him, and they decided to promote 3 others. And there was this chick who was getting promoted to lieutenant colonel, and she was so out of regs, man. And I was like, look, man, like I'm all about unconventional side. That's cool, whatever. But for promotion and ceremony and stuff, like this is a no-go for me.
It's really surprising. So I've seen it when I've been on active duty recently. There's stuff that like wouldn't fly in my reserve unit, and these are active duty, like junior enlisted soldiers. The stuff they're doing and saying, and I'm like, I can't believe this is like allowable now. It's
so I
insane.
see that on Carson,
I don't know
the young guys that disrespect NCOs or whatever it is, and I'm just like,
yeah.
So when people ask, what should I join? I go, if you're looking for something where it's the camaraderie and the structure and everything, join the Marines, because they're the ones still towing the line. I say, or pick the unconventional side to go into the Army. Try SF, Rangers, Civil Affairs, PSYOP, or 160th SOAR. So like a bunch of my friends are Black Hawk pilots out here, and I'm like, get out of this garrison environment. You guys got the flight time. The Night Stalkers are looking. They're like, yeah, they've reached out. I'm like, go do it. I was like, you will have such a better experience in the military. And all my friends who've stayed on the unconventional side and who've moved over to JSOC or were with asymmetrical warfare, they really enjoyed their time. They're all retiring now. They're happy and they know what they're doing with their lives. It's not like they're struggling to come out, because there's just been a lot of entities like Skill Bridge and Folds of Honor and all that stuff that is helping them transition out. But the unconventional guys, unfortunately, get a lot more support than the conventional guys. So there's nuances to it that I say. So yes and no.
And I used to think it was, but the more I'm seeing it, I think it's absolutely real. Kind of the Gen Z raised on a screen, post-COVID, feeling isolated, no real connection. I think the military, which is having a pretty extreme recruiting crisis right now, I think they have an opportunity to tap into almost what the Marines do and say, look, we're different. You're not going to do this. You're going to join a tight-knit community that does more than just sit in their basement and stream Twitch and play like Xbox.
Yeah.
You're going to be something more than that. You have an opportunity to get away from this lifestyle that isn't really apparently not appealing to anybody, and they haven't really tapped into that. The Army,
I've literally been saying the same thing. I'm like, that's the market. That's the effort. Is you point out and you go, that's dumb. Do you want to actually feel alive for once? Come join us, and then show like them like teamwork and people having friends, and then they're like going to grab drinks on the weekend, and then go back to, we do more than most people before 9 a.m.
This generation is like desperate for is like some form of purpose and belonging, rather than just sitting around with their friends like scrolling on their phones all day. And the military hasn't been able to like tap into that, pull them in. And granted, there's a number of reasons why like recruiting's down, a number of reasons, but
we're less focused on war fighting and more focused on PC stuff.
There's that. We're fat and out of shape. The medical stuff is big. So I don't know if you're familiar with MHS Genesis.
Do
you know what that is? So basically at MEPS, they instituted a new system that can pull all your medical files since you've been born. So you can't lie anymore and say, I don't have this, or I never had this, which everybody used to do. That's the only reason a lot of us were able to join the military. We weren't necessarily, but now you can't do that. People were getting disqualified for things that they otherwise, so that's a big problem. If they just killed that, that would help, but I don't know how many millions of dollars and things like that they invested in that system, so they'd look pretty, somebody would look bad if they're like, oh, actually, we're going to cut that. It just wouldn't be a good look. They're stuck with it to some extent. So what would you say are some of the benefits, tangible and intangible, that you got from the military and from the Army Reserve? I assume your college was paid for by the Army. So that's a tangible benefit. What else do you feel you got?
So you got to remember, I joined in 1999, so it was funny. Even when I was like a E5 in my unit, I was getting less pay than some of the E3s because they had all these kickers and additional money and post 9/11 benefits. And I was like, this sucks. But even then,
that must have felt
it was a punch to the nuts. But at the same time, they gave me a $10,000 student loan repayment program, which now like Biden's, hey, everybody gets 10 grand. I'm like, I want that. Make it retroactive. I paid off my student loans. So it paid my tuition, but I didn't want to work during college. And I was constantly gone. I dropped out of college 3 times because of deployments and stuff. So I was in, I was out, I was in, I was out. One time I had to reapply because they're like, look, man, you can't, this isn't, and I was like, hey, man, I was at war. This is not fair. So my mom literally had to write my admissions essay because I was in Afghanistan. Yeah, to let me back in.
Oh wow. Were you going
Yeah, I
back?
was going back to Oklahoma State, same
school, or were you?
Yeah, they didn't know what to do with it. I was like one of the first to deploy during that time period. They didn't know. They didn't know how to do anything at that point. That was 2003, 2004. So anyway, out of that, I think one of the most tangible benefits to that is one, I got my college paid for, which was great, and I still had to repay my student loans because I joined in an era. That's not the case anymore. You join now, you're going to have all those education benefits. You're going to have your post 9/11 benefits, and then the thing is, it set me up for the future. Like one, it taught me about leadership. It taught me, and I was an idiot. And this, like, from the people who read my book, I was like just this over the top frat boy who had a larger than life personality. And so that's how I earned my nickname Hollywood, is because I did a bunch of dumb stuff during mountain operations where I was trying to plan a party with fraternity brothers and not taking training seriously. It's like, how do we make trash can punch jungle? This is how everything's exploding around me.
Hey man, that story to me as well. That brought me. Yeah, I remember putting the garbage bags and trash cans and mixing it up with all the same exact stuff that you mentioned. Wow, so much of the book rang so true.
Yeah. Yeah. I had guys that were older, that were wiser, that I still look up to. There's a guy in my book named Paul Gonzalez, and that dude's got 25 years in now. When I met him, he was an E5. Now he's a lieutenant colonel. He's a pipe hitter supreme. Like, that dude has every award, like, badge stacked on his chest that you could possibly think of. And so learning leadership lessons from him and other guys that were strong, influential figures that taught me the right way to do things, that put up with my BS, and then we're like, we're going to mold this guy into a well and developed seasoned leader, is really vital. And if you will let your non-commissioned officers and officers form that persona in you, then you will excel much better in life. And obviously there are people who are just like, I just want to do my time in the military and get out. But I like, learn while you're there, because it's going to set you up for the future. And then on top of that, pick a job that is going to advance your future. So like when I got back from Iraq, I went to work for a company called Stratfor Rain. It's a geopolitical intelligence think tank. And my background and degrees are in graphic design and electronic media, but I had my CA side. So what they needed was a creative director who could, like, let's say they're like, okay, well, we need to track the Sinaloa cartel's movements in Mexico and graphically translate that. You're going to need somebody who understands, like, geopolitics and the CA mission and everything else, because I'm doing worldwide stuff. I remember when Russia invaded South Ossetia and annexed, like, Abkhazia and everything. Like, I understood that. I understood the history and the background and everything that was going on there. And so I'm graphically translating this. So I'm working with analysts every single day. And sometimes I even wrote pieces for the company. And then I got to work with a lot of really ingenious men and women. Like, one of my very close best friends is a guy named Peter Zion. He's a New York Times bestselling author. He's a geopolitical expert, very popular now. It's weird because seeing him at this way now, because he's like a huge, larger than life character. Like Cindy Crawford's read his book. He's been on Joe Rogan and everything, just all the insane stuff. And we just used to work together in that environment. And now I still do work for him. I'm a contractor for him. And we still get to argue about geopolitics and all that other fun stuff. So really, the CA mission set me up for success in the future. The military set me up for success in the future. And here's the other thing too, like, they were back to the marketing strategy that you were talking about. They were heading that direction, but going about it the wrong way. I don't think I would have been able to buy a house had I not been a vet. Like, in this environment, like, good luck. Yeah. You're going to please, how do you have 20% down in this environment with a 7% interest rate on a home? And good. And luckily I got in while the getting was good. But as a veteran, I didn't have to pay out of pocket. The VA backs my benefit, or my housing benefits and stuff. I'm not paying primary mortgage insurance because I'm a vet, because the VA it's covered. So there's so many benefits that people don't consider, and all they can think of is, oh, well, I'm going to go to war. And that's not the case. And I want to dispel that myth too. If you have people that are thinking about joining, everybody assumes that their story is going to be my story is going to be their story. I'm this unlucky SOB that ends up in a war that when I just joined for the college money, and then I'm outside the wire every single day. That only 10% of the military actually sees combat. 10%. So the other 90% are force multipliers, force enablers who help the combat operations go. If you want to see combat, you can pick a job like that. Like CA, you might, but there are different, we have our Cat A's and Cat B's, there's headquarters elements. It really depends on what you want to do. So you can go your entire career in the military without having to pull the trigger or do crazy pipe hitter stuff. You can join something that's going to help you out. If you want to become a lawyer, one of the craziest things that happened to me was like after I got out of the military, I went to see a dentist, and my last dentist I had been in Iraq with, so I just wrote his name down. And this chick goes,
He was punching you.
he was, fun story. Yeah. Fun story about that. It's in the book. Shot myself up in the face with Novocaine and partied with a bunch of dentists while in Iraq. So that was, it's a fun story. Read it in the book. But I wrote, the same guy from the book. I wrote his name down, and this chick walks in and she was taking over the practice. She's like, "Hey, I'm the new dentist." She looks down and she goes, "You know Zach?" And I was like, "Yeah." She was like, "I was in dentist school in the Army with him." And I was like, "What?" And again, she didn't have to deploy. And even her dentists on base, they sat there. You want to be a dentist or a doctor or something? Join the military. They'll pay for the entire thing for you. You want to be a pilot? Join the Air Force. It really depends. Like, they're going to train you and you're going to get these life skills and they're going to be incredible. And it's going to force you to grow up. It's going to force you to become a leader. And like, companies are desperate for men and women who've come from a military environment that can perform well under pressure because everybody else can't currently at the moment. And so we're in high demand.
I would say that is probably one of the greatest, I don't even know if I'd call it a skill, but the military, probably anywhere in the military, but especially combat arms, it teaches you to, I hate this word because it gets overused in the Army, but resilient. Like, you get comfortable being uncomfortable and being like, "Oh, this sucks. Okay, move on." A lot of people don't have that skill set. Like, they just shut down if something gets hard. I think the military teaches you to just keep driving on. And then you see these junior enlisted soldiers, junior NCOs who have just this ton of responsibility on their shoulders as like a 20, 22-year-old kid in charge of people, in charge of equipment, in charge of missions, all sorts of things, especially in war. And there's nothing that matches that level of responsibility in the corporate world. And this person was doing it as like essentially a kid. So I always find it really amazing. And I don't think most people in the civilian corporate world understand the level of responsibility that some of these people have. So I think we need to do a better job communicating that to them. But the other thing too, civilians seem to think that everybody who joins the military is like a door kicker, like weapons expert. And it's even people in the infantry don't necessarily, a lot of them somehow don't even know what they're doing, even though they're supposed to be trained on this. So you're not going to be necessarily kicking in doors and being Rambo just because you joined the Navy or something. Like, that's a very small percentage of our military. And even then, if you're not at war, you're not really going to be doing much of that anyway in real life.
I think even military people conflate that. So like, when you think about your grandfather and you're like, "Oh, my granddad was in World War II," your immediate thought is he stormed beaches, right? That was not the case. A lot of them did. Right. And if you look at the studies, a lot of them couldn't even pull the trigger in combat. We had to recondition a lot of our soldiers after World War II to do better training so that they were able to kill the enemy. And then same thing for Vietnam. Like, I just remember like growing up, and my dad's friends, a lot of them were Vietnam vets, and they were all pipe hitters. Like, that was and so I always grew up with the assumption you go to war and that's what it is. You know, these guys have been blown up, shot, fighting the Viet Cong and everything. But then later on in life, I met other Vietnam veterans, sat on bases and did all the rest of this stuff. And we unfortunately confused the reality of combat situations. And you look at guys like me where you're like, "Oh, good God, dude, you got blown up. You had all this crazy stuff happen to you and you were a reservist." And so people are like, "Don't join the military." And I'm like, "Oh man, like I'm an outlier. I'm a misnomer." So were the guys that I was overseas with, because I knew tons of it was about half of our unit, tested in the fires of combat. The other half just sat on a base. They were fine. They don't have their combat action badges or any of that stuff. So you look at these guys, like even now you hear somebody and they're wearing a Vietnam vet hat. my first thought is like, oh, this guy was probably in the. It's not really the case. Same thing for the World War II guys. And at first I was like, oh, and I thought my own grandfather was like crazy pipe hitter. And he didn't really see all that much combat. He saw some, but he missed the D-Day jump because he got pneumonia. It's probably why I'm alive.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, man. Easily could have been killed if he had been on that.
And he ended up getting transferred to Patton's Third ID in Germany because he missed the jump. So stuff like that just happens to where I don't want people consider, and especially parents, like they just get these ideas in their head. So the reality of the situation is you can pick a job, you can choose stuff. You're going to learn so much leadership and responsibility and things that an average 18 or 19-year-old is not going to learn. And I was 26 when I was a platoon sergeant in an E7 slot. 26 years old. I look back at that now being 43 and I'm like, that's dumb. Yeah, but that you got to remember, I had 8 years at that point in the military. So I had learned, I had grown, I had men mentor me. So you grow up fast and you learn quick. And so you're more adaptable and you're going to do better in your job in the long run.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to switch gears a bit, since the thing is I could talk to you for about 5 hours, and I'm not going to do that to you or to my wife.
No, same.
Come in here and
my wife and kids would kill me.
But I want to switch gears. I want to talk about your book, Where Cowards Go to Die, which I just said I finished today. Really interesting book, just a really good kind of almost like a historical piece of a snapshot in time of what peak GWOT looked like from the perspective of a civil affairs, Army Reserve, guy on the ground, soldier. So what inspired you to write the book? And I was curious, did you know in time as you were deploying and doing all these things, did you have an inkling that you were going to be writing about these experiences? Or
a lot of the stuff that I pulled from my book, I kept journals while I was in Afghanistan. And I did it out of this weird, morbid reason where I was like, if I die, at least my parents know and people know what will happen to me. Because you always hear about like how they don't know what happened, the Army lied to them or whatever it is. But then they get your footlocker of contents. And so I'd write about the day and what was going on. And I was never a writer. I'd always been a communicator, I would think, and could tell stories. Like I love stories. And my grandfather was a storyteller too. And I really didn't have a desire to write at all. And the way that I got into writing and how the book came about was when I got home from Iraq and then I transitioned out of the military. My best friend ended up becoming a Wall Street Journal bestselling author. And I was going to work for, I had started volunteering for this mental health organization called Heart Support. And it's run by Jake Luers, who's the lead singer of August Burn Red, whose hat I'm ironically wearing. He's a close friend of mine. So I'm very involved in the metal world. Like that's why every chapter of my book is named after a metal song, because I'm just a metalhead through and through. It just run like until they find a darker shade of black, I just wear black everywhere. But because I had seen like a lot of the struggles, and metal's huge in the military, like that's what you listen to while you're at war. And I had always connected with like the lyrics and the music and everything. And I saw that he was starting this mental health organization. I wanted to help because I'd gotten home and that's when the 22 a day had really started to come out. It was probably like 2010, 2011, even up to 2012. Yeah. And so they were looking for writers, and I wrote this op-ed for them. And I was like, I don't know that I'm any good. So I went to my friend and I was like, hey man, can you teach me how to write? And he was like, only if you're serious and you take the craft serious. And I was like, all right, deal. And so he just went through with a red pen. We cleaned it up, submitted it. It did really well. And then I met Jake after a concert and he was like, hey, I'd really like you to do more stuff and help lead this. So inevitably I became the executive director, quit my corporate job, took a 60% pay cut. That sucked. And then just built this thing from the ground up with Jake, and then just started hiring staff. And because of my leadership experience in the military, like I was able to build the team from the ground up and pick people that I knew were going to thrive at it. And so I hired other veterans too, because I was smart like that. I was like, they'll work for low pay, long hours. And
just for the record.
So I start writing and it continues to get more and more popular. And then I learn about this platform Medium and I start writing on there just to see. And I have this article in 2016 just blow up. And it was the first time I'd written about my time in combat and war. And one of my buddies who's in the book, Kit McVeigh, he had started a WordPress blog where he was like recounting and recording like all the stuff that had happened to him while we were in Ramadi. And I was like, oh man, that's really brave. That's really awesome. And I asked him why he did it. He was like, a lot of our guys have died or they've had cancer or whatever because of the burn pits and stuff. He said, if something happens to me, I want my kids to know what happened over there. And I was like, that's really brave. And so I wrote this article. It blew up for Memorial Day. It was about, I had been learning about moral injury, which is the psychological damage that occurs when soldiers have to do things that violate their sense of right and wrong. And everybody thinks they know how they're going to act, like, oh, I'm going to be upstanding and Superman. But a lot of times you descend into the barbarity too in combat, and things that you normally do, you wouldn't do. And then just seeing stuff that you would never have to, people blown apart and stuff like that, or your friends die, like it just sticks with you. And so I was learning how it's so much different than post-traumatic stress. And so I wrote about like how this is what a lot of guys in the GWOT era are dealing with that have seen combat, and it just, man, it went off. And I talked about the civilian responsibility toward it. And I had a conversation with my editor at Medium because I started writing like mental health stuff that was blowing up on the platform there too. And I had just been continually working on my craft. And so I had these editors that I had started working professionally. And I said, hey, I hit a little bit of writer's block. And I said, hey, what do you want me to write on? And she said, oh man, we love your war stuff. And I was like, oh, I don't write about that. I don't know. And she's like, that's a travesty. And I was like, what? Her name is Steph. And she said, it's a travesty. She's like, all these stories of love and loss and barbarity and the humanity and complexity of combat are being lost to the annals of history because you guys come home and won't talk about it. And she goes, and we need to hear it and all of its ugliness. And some civilians have really blown me up because of that, because I've written some stories that are very true, but are very hard to read. And it's the problem that a lot of veterans face is when civilians hear those stories, they either do the fake, they try and be polite, but it communicates you're a monster. And then, so we don't talk about it. And then we go home and kill ourselves because we never dealt with the trauma or the background and stuff. And so she really set me free in going, yeah, there's nothing brave about me just keeping my stories to myself, even if people shun me for it. So I guess I'm going to go out on a limb and start writing this stuff. And so I did. And dude, all my war stuff, like on Medium, just every time I write something, people loved it. And I was like, this is so weird because most people don't know what it's like, but they're curious. And so agents all of a sudden I started getting like DMs, like people are sneaking in my DMs on Instagram and they're all like agents, like literary agents. And they're like, have you ever considered writing a book? And I'm like, what? This is weird. But so again, I went back to my friend, the Wall Street Journal bestseller, and he's in the book too, just under a pseudonym. I was like, hey man, I don't know what I'm doing. I got to pick a literary agent. People want me to write a book. And he was like, all right, here's the industry. And he like just broke it all down for me. I interviewed all these agents and then finally signed with one that I was like, yeah, this person has my best interests in mind. And then I wrote a book proposal. We started shopping it around. And originally I wanted to just write like epic fantasy because that's what I read. I love fantasy and science fiction. And I was like, yeah, that's what I want to do. And they're like, we think you should start with your bread and butter, which is war. And I was like, fine. So I put together this book proposal. We shopped it around. Eventually I got 2 offers. But first I had to go through that rejection process. And again, this goes back to that resilience grit word. I wasn't worried because I was like, I'm used to rejection. I'm used to things sucking. So she would come back and she'd be like, oh no, they said no. I was like, I don't care. I was like, we'll keep going. In 2020, I got a book deal right as the pandemic was kicking off. And I'm glad I got in before all that because it really crippled the publishing industry. And then from there, I wrote my book in a year. I would wake up at 5:30 every day before my kids were up and write for an hour, finished it in a year, and then sent it in. And it was cool because my publisher was like, you've written something extremely special here. We're not used to having people who can write. And since then, it's gone on to win 6 major literary awards. A couple of the essays have become award-winning essays from the book. I just got this one, like here, first prize ribbon kind of thing that came in the mail. So it's been exciting.
Truly, it feels like it should be at some point, like maybe in the National Archives, because it's such a unique perspective of a period in time of what was going on and what that war experience was like. Is there any talk, any possibility of a...
I had a couple dudes who were like, it was like low budget stuff. And I was like, I don't want to do that because I own the rights to my publisher doesn't. And that was the big thing that I fought for is I was like, I want the rights to like TV and movie. And so I still own those, which are good. That's in my contract. But yeah, I would love to see it because it's not a story about me being awesome. It's the story about basically the hero's journey that we all go through. This like dumb kid who's an idiot, who has to be mentored by men that are wiser than him, who gets stuck in the crucible of life and combat, and then has to deal with the ramifications of what he's done to readjust to civilian society. And that came for me, I write about this in the book, from a moral, a physical, an existential, and even a spiritual battle for me. And I always bring this up on podcasts. Like, I've seen a lot of clinicians that miss this aspect. And I tell people, and I write about this in the book, that war is a very spiritual experience because it's like you're playing God. You have the power to protect life or to take it away. And regardless of what you believe or don't believe, there's like kind of this mystery, this unknownness to what happens when you die. And even though I think I know with 100% certainty, and other people do too, whether they're Buddhists or Muslims or Christians or whoever, or secular humanists, we don't know. It's that great unknown. And because of that, there's, yes.
All right, so you were saying you were God.
In war, it's like playing God. You have the power to protect life or take it away. And there's this great unknown to what happens when we die. And I think I know with 100% certainty. Other people think they know, depending on your religious flavor or not, or secular humanism, or you go into the great nothingness. But there's something like extremely spiritual that happens when you point an M4 carbine and rifle at a man, and you pull the trigger and you send them into the great unknown, or you watch somebody go into the great unknown. And we're missing out on that aspect. And a lot, luckily, the VA and other places are catching up with it to where when they're dealing with veterans and stuff, you can't just drug them to death with pills or whatever. That's such a stupid response. And to say, hey, you were strong enough to go to war, but now you're not strong enough to live in the most comfortable environment you could possibly be in, that's insane. And so they're addressing symptoms as opposed to root issues. And so writing the book and going through and recognizing all of those aspects and multi-layered aspects, to me, is really important, and for other soldiers and men and women to understand. And so out of that, I would love to see it become like a miniseries, like Band of Brothers or Generation Kill or any of that stuff, because the story isn't just about me. It's about the people and the locals there, and then the men and women that brought me up from stupidity into that area. Because I think Gonzo would be such a cool character to put on the big screen. And then I would love to add other people that weren't in the book and be like an advisor or whatever for the miniseries and stuff. But yeah, I'm trying to get it into the SOF archive right now too. So I have friends at Bragg Liberty who are like, yeah, this is a great book that really dives into the CA mission and then also what happened during the GWOT and counterinsurgencies. I'd love to see it happen. I'm not holding my breath. Like, I'm just a small dude in a big pond, and there are other people with bigger names and whatnot. If by some stroke of luck, like Chris Pratt decides to pick up my book and read it, because that's how the Terminal List got made, I'd be like, yay! Because at that point, here's what you need to know about the movie industry. A lot of times, A-list celebrities will read a book or whatever, and they're like, oh, this should become a movie. And then like Hollywood just backs the cash truck up to their house and was like, make it. So yeah, like right. Chris Pratt's trainer introduced him to the Terminal List, and that's how that got made. So
is that the one where he like goes?
No, Terminal List is by Jack Carr, who's a Navy SEAL. Like, dude's legit, good dude. Jack Carr's not his real name though. That's actually his pen name. But he does Danger Close and all that other stuff. He's one of those really good, quiet professionals who went the fiction route. And so he took a guy who's special operations, and then he gets out and he has to think like modern day Tom Clancy. And Pratt read it and was like, love these books. And then Amazon backed the cash truck up to his house, and there you go.
I'm going to help you get this made into a series, but you have to
100%. I'll bring in all the CA guys you want to do cameos. It'll be funny. You guys can all be the cadre and the instructors at Bragg doing stupid stuff.
Yeah, I'll just be some random that gets like killed in the background and is never referenced in any real way. But so has the Army gotten better, or the military gotten better with dealing with veterans that are facing these types of mental issues? I imagine they didn't really know what they were doing back in 2010, and I'm hoping that they've started to figure that out a bit better by now.
Yes and no. It depends on where you are. A lot of times, the VA is really short-staffed on clinicians. That is the big problem. I get a lot of messages from actually VA clinicians on Instagram or through my website talking about how they're actually using my book now to help veterans process their stuff. And they're like, this is the realest account. Because for me, I don't let the book be like, woe is me. I end on, there's nothing courageous about staying stuck. That's a coward's way out. And so I want to push men and women to get better. Like, you're either going to get busy living and getting better, or you're just going to die. And if you never deal with the stuff that you've gone through, you effectively die as a coward because you took the coward's way out. And that's the whole crux of my book, is you'll either have to put a coward to death to become the person that you're intended to be, or you'll die as one because you never dealt with the stuff that you needed to. And so what I'm seeing is, depending on the VA facility, there's really good programs in place. And they really are. They're starting to push the boundaries with the psychedelic treatments, ketamine infusions. I started ketamine infusions for chronic pain because, like, the VA did an MRI on my back and they're like, you're screwed. So they sent me to a spine specialist and like pain management. And they're like, hey, you're headed for a spinal fusion at this point. I'm like, great. I don't want to do that. They're like, what are you doing for pain management? I was like, I don't take opioids. They're like, have you ever considered ketamine infusions? I was like, that's a party drug. I don't know about that. Luckily, my brother's a nurse anesthetist, so I called him. He's like, 100% do it. So I started doing these infusions once. They really help with the pain. Like, it's insane. So I feel like a normal human once again. But the side effect to it is like, my mental clarity and stability has been the best ever. My wife's, you're so much more calm. You're so much more in tune with your emotions. And like, all the studies are showing that, like, in conjunction with therapy, and I got a couple of friends who've been manic depressive or struggled with post-traumatic stress to do it, and they're doing so much better. So there's things that they're doing that are really good. There's also nonprofit entities that are doing phenomenal work. So you got like Tom Spooner's Warrior's Heart, Virginia, and then Texas. And then the one that I personally donate to, and I know, is Micah Fink. He does Heroes and Horses, and both of them are 41-day rehabilitative programs for combat veterans. And so they take it from all aspects. They take it from the emotional, the physical, the intellectual, and then the spiritual side. So Micah has them do meditation and practices that they're comfortable with during their 41-day. There's equine therapy, there's cold plunges, it's clean eating, it's dealing through their stuff. And Warrior's Heart does the same thing. And those are starting to partner now with the Department of Veteran Affairs and then other military entities to have our warriors go through that. I know a buddy of mine is a guy named, he's on CBS's SEAL team, Tyler Gray. He's a former Delta guy, and he plays a SEAL. It's really fun. Delta guy in real life, and then plays a SEAL on TV. And he did Warrior's Heart, where he realized he had crashed and burned, like, while he was in the movie industry. And he went through it and did the 41-day and said it was like the best thing for him. So there's a lot of really cool stuff that's coming out of the community where I think things are getting better. But also at the same time, I think there are other issues that they're just like sweeping under the rug. Like, I had to go up to Golden because they were like, hey, you have toxic metal embedded fragment stuff. We want to make sure. And then there's burn pit. And so basically the DOD is aware of everything that's happened to us via burn pits, but they're not talking about the jammers, which is basically just fried our brains while we're in the turrets. Yep. I asked my friend, he's the electronic warfare officer for JSOC and stuff. And I said, hey man, I said, I know the burn pits are a big thing. I was like, what's up with the jammers, like the Chameleon, the Duke, the Warlock, like all that stuff? I was like, I know it's all still technically classified as far as stuff. And he goes, I'll give you the official DOD response. We're aware of brain tumors and cancer clusters forming in our soldiers. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So there's stuff, and I think that's the difficult part is if you look at like those of us that are GWOT vets, we're starting to age. I'm in my 40s. Most of us are in our 40s and 50s at this point. The younger generation, if you are later GWOT, you're probably going to be in your late 30s at this point, or mid 30s. And with that, the issues are going to compound as you get older. You just get older, you just wake up hurt sometimes. And I think in some ways they're doing what they did to Vietnam veterans with Agent Orange. It took 20 years for them to even admit the burn pits. And then we still haven't even talked about the jammers and what those could have done, and the radioactive frequencies and radio waves and radar and like all that, how it's affected our bodies. Why is it that me and all my teammates, we all had girls first? And most all of us I'm like one of the few that actually has a son. Like, it's really weird.
They call that the operator's curse, because I've heard that before, where like these high-speed pipe hitters, they always have daughters. They don't have sons.
So like Gonzo has 3 daughters. My buddy Kit, who's also in the book, he has 4. All of us have girls.
I love it. there was a character named Gonzo, because I think everybody in the military knows a Gonzalez who everybody calls Gonzo. And it's just so funny to hear.
And the funny part is you hear his name and you're like, oh yeah, he's a Hispanic dude. He's not. This is the funny part. So he's a pasty white Irish American, but I believe his dad was adopted. And so they took on the Gonzalez last name, but his wife is Hispanic. So it worked out really well for him, and especially for his daughters, because they're Hispanic looking too. So I was like, oh man, you've worked it out for him.
What do you hope the listeners and readers of Where Cowards Go to Die, what do you want them to take away from your experience, your book, and everything we've talked about here, especially if they're struggling with some of these same issues that you talk about?
The challenge is, I remember when I got home and my wife had left. I'm remarried. I've been remarried for 13 years. My wife is awesome. We have a great marriage. But
interject again. Your book touches on every trope.
Yeah, I hit every veteran stereotype. It's funny. Like coming home, being homeless, living on my friend's couch. I went through a divorce and I got home from Iraq and I was like, I got nothing left, man. This sucks. And I just remember thinking I want to die. I was entertaining suicide ideation. And I just had this bolt and this epiphany that if I took myself out, then I would give Al-Qaeda and the insurgency and the Taliban everything that they've ever wanted. And that's what they're doing. They're killing us at home at a rate they never did overseas. And they don't even have to do anything anymore. They just have to wait for us to get worse. And there's nothing courageous about that. And so to those that are struggling, I would say you're going to give the enemy the win that they always want. But the opposite side is you can give them the middle finger if you get better. And that's the brave part. I like to call it post-traumatic growth is the way that I refer to it as. And do the work. If you do the work, you'll get better. Put in the time, the effort, the energy. I've done it. I've done everything from EMDR to 12-step and I did 12-step for self-hate of all things. Just because I hated who I had to become overseas and the kind of the violent stuff. And like I talked about, there's this story in the book called Dog Strike, and it went over really poorly recently on an interview, but it was a real portrayal of war. And I was like, maybe I am this stupid monster. And I ended up calling a bunch of dudes that, and I was like, what did you guys do this stuff? And they're like, yeah, we did. They're like, we just don't talk about it. And I was like, okay, that's fair. And they're like, yeah, people would look at us like monsters. So I get that. There's a lot of fear. If I'm honest about what I went through or what I did, then I'm going to be rejected. But the flip side of that coin is you're just going to stay stuck too. So you have to put in the work. You have to do the hard work of getting better. And I don't know what that looks like for the people listening, but it's different for everybody. And I don't want our generation to be marked as a generation by mental health and mental illness. I want us to be marked as like my grandfathers did. We're strong, resilient. We got to work. And when things were hard, we got after it. So that's what I would like to see in that respect from the book aspect. As far as civilians go, like a very clear picture of what really happened to us during the longest running wars in U.S. history. Like right now, you're just getting snapshots. I've been on Marcus Luttrell's podcast. He's a great dude. And a lot of those Navy SEAL guys are awesome, but that's a microcosm of what happened. That is a snapshot of one battle and 20 years of war. And this gives you more of you go from the 80s all the way to the 2020s. So you get 40 years smashed in from like my upbringing, what that looked like, the U.S. foreign policy during the Bush and Clinton years, and then what it transferred to after post 9/11, and then realize like what you asked of the men and women because there was no draft and what it effectively did to us, so that it builds some compassion and that you're able to own your part to that. Because in times past, like civilians were a part of the reintegration process, and we've removed that from our warriors. And I think that's a really important aspect. So I want readers to really be able to put themselves in the shoes and go, I don't know what I would have done, but this seems like the most accurate portrayal. So out of that, it's really for me, just getting people to see an overarching view of everything from the geopolitical narrative to what happened to our soldiers, to the mental health perspective, to the civilian side of the responsibility, and then make wise decisions out of that. And then encourage the younger generation who's thinking about join up, man. Like, we want you in here. Be the change in the system that we need in our military, because right now we're getting a bad rep. Everything has been so politicized, and we're meant to be apolitical. And I've really tried to keep that in mind. Like, I know there's a lot of vet influencers right now who like to get on there and rail about like how they're Team Trump or Team Harris or whatever it is. I stay out of that stuff. It's irrelevant for me because I tend to take the South Park model where it's always between a douche and a turd sandwich anyways. And my job, is to uphold the Constitution of the United States to the best of my ability and live in a way that honors my friends that gave their life overseas so that I can live a life that honors their legacy. And so that's what I want to do.
No, that's awesome. I thought the book was a great soup to nuts look at who you were, who you became, how you joined the military, what you did, and then coming back and dealing with everything. So I thought it was a great book. It's one that really everyone in the military or the civilian world should read. Sledge, thank you so much for joining us here today on the podcast and sharing your story. For the listeners, check out Ben's book, Where Cowards Go to Die. We'll link it in the description. And you want to throw out your IG as well?
If you want to look me up online, I'm really easy. You can literally Google my name. You can Google Ben Sledge or Benjamin Sledge. Everything that pops up is me. It's going to have my Instagram handles. I don't think I'm on X anymore. I got bored there. But everywhere else I'm on, and you can find me there.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much, man. For the listeners, stay part-timing.
Thank you.
Out here. Thank you, Ben.